Welcome to Book 1 of the Flash History biography series entitled Eleanor Roosevelt's Life of Soul-Searching and Self-Discovery, from Depression and Betrayal to First Lady of the World. Part 1. A Bitter Beginning. Context and Comments. Knowing the context of Eleanor's era deepens the value of her accomplishments. Through the span of Eleanor's life, from 1884 to 1962, the laws of science make quantum leaps forward. She will read newspaper headlines of an aircraft flying a few hundred feet, to jets breaking the sound barrier and man going to outer space. It's the end of boiling water on a wood stove and the beginning of popcorn in the microwave. And the science of war excels as the details of strapping a gas mask on a war horse is exchanged for a diagram of strapping an atomic bomb on an airplane. Liberty and justice for all is far from being realized. The veterans of the North and South gather at Gettysburg for the 50-year reunion of the Civil War. At this time, it is much easier to plan if the, quote, Negroes, unquote, are not invited. Women won't be given the right to vote until 1920, which is a glaring irony considering Queen Victoria has been capable of ruling the whole British Empire from 1837 to 1901, 64 years. For the young, their lives read like gruesome chapters in a Charles Dickens novel. 2 million children provide cheap labor in coal mines, canneries, and steel mills. There are no laws protecting children, but there are laws to protect animals. In the late 1800s, the first recorded successful case to protect an abused child is won by declaring the child as part of the animal kingdom. It will not be until 1938 when a minimum age and work hours are federally regulated. Are these the good old days, if life expectancy is a brief 45 years? Millions die each year of infectious diseases, and 35,000 die every year in industrial accidents. There is no workers' compensation, no unemployment pay, and no insurance. Severance pay is given because something at work got severed, a hand or a foot. In any arena, Eleanor fights injustice and perseveres against overwhelming odds and chilling cruelties. Like a Wonder Woman in support hose, she will win battles on the local, the national, and the global scale. Her life is an example of moral courage, and she becomes internationally known as First Lady of the World. First, she must survive her childhood. Chapter 1. Childhood. Baby Eleanor is born into the ostentatious display of upper-class opulence known as the Gilded Age. Eleanor's mother, Anna Livingston Ludlow Hall, is the belle of the ball for New York City. Basking in self-assurance, she can thumb her nose at guest lists that include the Vanderbilts and Astors. Anna also knows that within her lineage is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. This gives her self-esteem a nice dash of superiority. Now she just needs a husband. Eleanor's future father, Elliot Roosevelt, has a checkered past that would land anyone else in a jail cell, rehab, or the morgue. Elliot's excuses include sibling rivalry with his overachieving brother, the future President Theodore Roosevelt. Avoiding his brother's shadow, Elliot enjoys adventurous hunting trips in India, China, and Ceylon. Health problems are exacerbated in a struggle with sexual identity, alcohol, and shame. His misery is exposed in his letters to home. In 1881, Elliot returns from his latest trip. He is in New York City, and he meets Anna. Having these two characters in place, the stage is set for a tragic play of which Shakespeare would be proud. With all the passion and commitment of a charming alcoholic, Elliot writes about Anna, a sweet-hearted, a true, loving, earnest woman, womanly in all purity, holiness, and beauty, an angel in tolerance, in forgiveness, and in faith. This list reflects Elliot's romantic ideals, not Anna's character. Anna, equally unrealistic, is flattered with the attention of the most eligible bachelor in New York City. Like media coverage of movie stars, Anna and Elliot's daily affairs are frequently featured in the newspapers. Anna marries Elliot, and this couple has the smug security of knowing they belong. Eleanor is born, and Anna is disappointed that her firstborn child is not a boy. Adding to this frustration, Anna describes her daughter as a more wrinkled and less attractive baby than the average. As Eleanor grows, it is obvious that her character is as somber as her physical appearance is plain. Eleanor's habit of waiting quietly in the doorway, waiting and wanting to be acknowledged, and waiting to be asked in have been deemed, quote, shy, end quote. Anna intensifies Eleanor's insecurities by belittling her. Eleanor remembers her mother saying to any company in the room, "She's such a funny child, so old-fashioned that we always call her Granny." Eleanor says of those times, "I wanted to sink through the floor in shame." One of her earlier childhood memories of being with her mother, she quotes, "I would sit at the head of her bed and stroke her head. The feeling that I was useful was perhaps the greatest joy I had experienced." It will be at least 25 years until Eleanor learns to boldly walk in or walk out of any door she wants. But now, as a child, she is starving for attention and acceptance. One light in her life is her father. Here, she is needed. Elliot has not been successful in any of the lucrative jobs that are put in place for him. His life is a constant cycle of mishaps, from foolish accidents, drugs, drinking, hostile episodes at home, and then absence away from the family. When Elliot returns, he can withstand Anna's harsh rebukes only by going to Eleanor for unquestioning acceptance. In exchange for this adulation, Elliot dotes on his dear little Nell. Eleanor glories in the attention, and it gives her some feeling of worth. Anna has a second child and is pleased to have produced a son. But the good news doesn't halt the gradual disintegration between her and Elliot. In an effort to stop the downward spiral, Anna decides to pack up the family and tour Europe. Any happy moments are distorted with the dread that Elliot will start drinking or is already drunk. The visit to Paris coincides with Anna's due date for a third child. Eleanor is shunted off to a convent to live until after the baby is born. Eleanor is not even 6. Alone in a foreign country, Eleanor feels cast aside by her family and could use some reassurance from the nuns. Seeing another little girl comforted because she has swallowed a coin, Eleanor tells the nuns she too has swallowed a coin. The nuns are suspicious and discover Eleanor has lied. Anna, disgraced by Eleanor's actions, comes to retrieve her daughter. Eleanor recalls, "I remember the drive home as one of utter misery, for I could bear swift punishment far better than long scoldings." The strain of keeping the family intact is taking a toll on Anna. Elliot threatens suicide and is now living with a mistress in Paris. When his estate is signed over to Anna, he promises to get better. Not convinced, Anna packs up the children and heads back to New York. The worst of it, what is most unforgivable, is the family shame is made public. The headlines in the New York Herald declare, "Eleanor Roosevelt, demented by excesses, wrecked by liquor and folly. He is now confined in an asylum for the insane near Paris. Proceedings to save the estate. Commissioners in lunacy appointed on petition of his brother Theodore and his sister Anna, with his wife's approval." When Elliot finally returns to New York City, he plays for Eleanor's sympathy. When Anna learns that Elliot has an illegitimate child and that the mother is making a ploy to go public, she limits the contact he has with his children. Eleanor and her father keep in touch by writing. During her growing years of 7 to 9, Eleanor spends her days waiting for another letter. The arrivals are sporadic, but the empty promises that unfold from each envelope are constant. Elliot strokes the delusion that someday he will return and they will live happily together. Anna, as the sole guardian for the children, is busy ensuring their future. In the event anything should happen to her, Grandmother Hall, Anna's mother, will have custody of Eleanor and her 2 brothers. In fact, Anna and the children move back to live with Anna's mother. Extra bedrooms are not the problem, since Grandmother has 2 mansions, one on the Hudson River for the summer and one in New York City for the winter. Tragic stories of Anna and Elliot continue. The family has so deteriorated that when Anna is dying of diphtheria, she refuses to let Elliot come see her. Within months of this loss, Eleanor's brother, Ellie, dies of scarlet fever. Eleanor remembers, "Death meant nothing to me, and one fact wiped out everything else. My father was back, and I would see him very soon." Elliot's brief visits to Eleanor and her brother Hall show the ravages of this man's self-absorption have warped any vestiges of kindness and doting. Elliot's need to still appear cavalier is indulged when taking Eleanor on reckless horse-cart rides. During these brash jaunts, Eleanor tries desperately to win his approval and not show her fear. When he comes by to take her for a walk with the dogs, Eleanor swallows any anger and disappointment as Elliot uses this opportunity to stop by his club and have a drink. Eleanor is left waiting. On one occasion, she stands for 6 hours while holding the dogs. She sees her father carried out, and it's the doorman who takes Eleanor back to Grandmother Hall's house. Clinging to dreams of a home with her father, Eleanor is in denial of these disappointing episodes. Her indomitable spirit will someday win accolades from around the world, but right now it is pitifully misdirected. Elliot continues to send endearing letters to Eleanor, but there won't be many more. His brother Teddy writes, "Elliot is up and about again, and I hear is drinking heavily. If so, he must break down soon." 2 days after Teddy's declaration, this prediction comes true. Elliot has been using stimulants again, suffering from delusions, and at some point jumps out a parlor window. He is knocked unconscious and dies. A newspaper article covering this story politely recalls the past. Quote, "There was a time when there were not many more popular young persons in society than Mr. and Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt." End quote. Members from Elliot's side of the family want Eleanor to be sent to Allenwood, an all-girls school in England. Family aunts had attended this school, and Eleanor's parents had previously met and been impressed with the head teacher. The idea is rejected by Grandmother Hall, who claims she wants the grandchildren home to keep a close eye on them. Grandmother Hall, a prior debutante herself, is only 51 and has her own problems. The trouble started when her husband passed away several years ago. Mr. Hall had always controlled the money and the children. While lavish parties and Parisian clothes for his family kept up public appearances, the private reality was a strict code of conduct for exuberant children. When he dies, the monastic ambiance goes with him. Mrs. Hall, treated as a child herself, is ill-equipped to run the house full of their children. At the time of Eleanor's stay, their ages range from 16 to 25. With behaviors reflecting varying levels of self-indulgence, romantic flings, and drinking, the mood of the mansion has ramped up to the raucous level of a frat house. To support these excesses, Mrs. Hall is using the trust funds of her grandchildren. Eleanor and her younger brother Hall have a yearly income of $7,500, which equates to approximately $180,000 per year in today's money. This wealth is not reflected in Eleanor's wardrobe. She has 2 dresses. If one gets dirty in play and the other hasn't been washed yet, she must wear a dirty dress. Adding to this misfit appearance is her height. For years, her dresses are short, shapeless, and outdated because they are remade hand-me-downs from the aunts. Eleanor, reflecting back on her childhood, says, "Playing with children was difficult for me because play had not been an important part of my own childhood." This goes from bad to worse. Friends for Eleanor are few and far between. They are afraid to come and visit. The uncles, too often intoxicated, have been known to start shooting a gun out of the second-story window over the heads of approaching guests. On top of that, there is Madeline. She's the governess who could easily be mistaken as Cinderella's stepmother. How cruel is it when someone who has been pulling your hair now cuts holes in the socks that you just darned? Madeline compounds the torment by bestowing kindness to Eleanor's brother, Hall. Eleanor's cousin recalls, "I remember Madeline. She was a terrifying character. It was the grimmest childhood I have ever known. Who did she, Eleanor, have? Nobody." Grandmother does provide more structure to her granddaughter's daily life. On occasion, Eleanor's uncles teach her how to play tennis, ride a bike, and jump with her pony. With her aunts, Eleanor recites poetry, enjoys music, and goes rowing on the Hudson River. Eleanor's education, which prior to this has been sketchy, is now filled in with literature, French, German, and piano lessons. These could be degrees of improvements for Eleanor's life, but if sporadic afternoons of attention are compensation for outbursts from drunk uncles and drama queen aunts, then the balance toward a healthy environment is in the red. Often alone, Eleanor spends time escaping to a dream world in her books and grows even more remote. Eleanor's cousin remembers the house. "I never wanted to go. The grim atmosphere of that house. There was no place to play games. Unbroken gloom everywhere. We ate our suppers in silence. The general attitude was, 'Don't do this.'" As the aunts become young women, they have commandeered the library to smoke cigarettes and carouse with their male visitors. The uncles escalate their escapades to such an extent that Grandma is now worried about Eleanor's safety. A friend of Eleanor's asked, "Why are there 3 locks on the inside of her bedroom door?" Eleanor answers, "To keep my uncles out." Grandmother Hall decides it is time to send Eleanor away to school. The year is 1899. The emphasis of education for women is preparation for future dinner parties, not politics or public policy. Luckily, the teachings at Allenwood contradict these conventions. The students, all female, are expected to expand their mental horizons and become independent thinkers with their own commitment to personal and social responsibility. It is perfect for Eleanor. Within the first year, Eleanor earns respect and regard as one of the girls' primary go-to resources. Fellow students needing advice, a compassionate shoulder to lean on, or help with their studies recognize Eleanor's kindness and willingness to assist. Eleanor's heart of compassion is acknowledged. No one calls her Granny. Eleanor is becoming confident and her personality is flourishing. She is picked for the field hockey team and she remembers back to that day as one of the proudest moments of my life. In classes and discussions, Eleanor is expected to give thoughtful commentary, not parroted politically correct response. She is encouraged to hammer out her own logic and assert her own opinions. Eleanor's intense and serious perspective is appreciated by Mademoiselle Sylvestre, the head teacher. A quote by Eleanor, as she remembers back on those days, is, quote, "It was once said that men did not marry women who showed too much intelligence. In my youth, I knew women who hid their college degrees as if they were one of the 7 deadly sins. But all that is passing, and so will pass many other prejudices that have their origin in the ancient tradition that women are byproducts of creation." Taking a personal interest in Eleanor, Mademoiselle Sylvestre gives her motherly attention in grooming and health. Encouraged to shop for herself, Eleanor enjoys clothes that are up to date and appropriately fit her elegant 6-foot figure. Future critics who decry her as a drudge should be reminded that one of her first choices for a new dress is a glamorous deep red fabric, hardly the color for a stick in the mud. Mademoiselle Sylvestre keeps Grandmother Hall informed about Eleanor. She writes, "All that you said when she came here of the purity in her heart, the nobleness of her thought, has been verified by her conduct among people who were at first perfect strangers to her. I often found that she influenced others in the right direction. She is full of sympathy for all those who live with her and shows an intelligent interest in everything she comes in contact with. As a pupil, she is very satisfactory, but even that is of small account when you compare it with the perfect quality of her soul." Holidays are spent going to London theater and visits to Paris. Mademoiselle Sylvestre requests Eleanor accompany her on a summer trip to Italy. Eleanor, now 16, is thrilled with the opportunity to be in charge of tickets, train schedules, and packing the trunks. She experiences local foods, wines, and traipsing around Florence by herself. It's a far cry from the lonely child shutting herself away in her bedroom to read books. Eleanor has to go home for the following summer, and her Aunt Pussy arrives in London to escort her back to New York. Pussy, one of Grandmother Hall's daughters, is accustomed to Eleanor being a sympathetic listener to the details of her latest romantic crisis. Now Pussy finds that Eleanor has become accustomed to responding with her own opinion and having that opinion valued. This is not what Aunt Pussy wants. Pussy's revenge is telling Eleanor that because of her looks, she will never find a man to be interested in her. Pussy then unleashes the ultimate ammunition. All the scandalous stories about Elliot. Eleanor is crushed. Eleanor goes to her grandmother to have this information disputed. Instead, Grandmother confirms the stories and increases the anguish by telling Eleanor there is no one to escort her back to England at the end of the summer. Since social customs dictate that young ladies outside their homes must always be accompanied, Eleanor cannot go back to Allenwood. Is Eleanor still the little girl that stands meekly in a doorway, waiting for someone to tell her what to do? Will she fall into the rut of the rich and accept her shallow lot in life? If so, Eleanor will be nothing more than an obscure name on a branch of the Roosevelt family tree. This may be Eleanor's first act of defiance. Eleanor finds a temporary nanny to escort her across the Atlantic back to Allenwood. At the end of the following school year, Grandmother insists it is time to come back to New York City for the start of the fall social season. Eleanor will be turning 18. It is time to find a husband. Mademoiselle Sylvestre sends Eleanor off with this letter. From this very minute, when I am writing to you, life, your life, which is entirely new and entirely different, and in several respects entirely contradictory, is going to take you and drag you into its turmoil. Protect yourself to some extent against it, my dear child. Protect yourself above all from the standpoint of your health. Give some of your energy, but not all, to worldly pleasures which are going to beckon you. And even when success comes, as I'm sure it will, bear in mind that there are more quiet and enviable joys than to be among the most sought-after of women at the ball. 1,000 and 1,000 tendernesses to my Tottie, whom I shall always love. It is the last time Eleanor will see her beloved teacher. They will correspond for the next few years, and Eleanor will always have her photo nearby. But Mademoiselle Sylvestre will die before Eleanor is able to visit England again. Eleanor now resides at Grandmother Hall's New York City mansion. This might sound grand until you factor in Aunt Pussy is also living there and is more popular and histrionic than ever. Grandmother Hall stays up at the house on the Hudson, still trying to cover for her alcoholic sons, although she lets Uncle Valley come visit the city once in a while for weekend binges. Eleanor, younger by several years, is expected to keep her aunt and uncle out of too much trouble. During this first year back, Hall, Eleanor's only surviving younger brother, is away at a private school. It is Eleanor who writes him every day and visits him on holidays. Her sense of responsibility dictates that she takes on a mothering role for him and provide him a home. This additional duty is an emotional demand she juggles throughout Hall's life. Sadly, she will see this smart young man live a short life riddled with the poor decisions of an alcoholic. The social season is starting, and Eleanor is expected to gaily attend balls and cotillions as part of her coming out. Akin to the marketing of toys at Christmas, the question to be answered is, who will be the belle of the ball? This is determined by who can create the biggest buzz, i.e., attract the most dance partners, the most glamorous dresses, the most articles in the social column, and be the most beautiful. All this affects the rest of a woman's life, since this is her only legacy. Eleanor's mother had been the belle of the ball. Eleanor's aunts, each year of their own coming out, had also been the belle of the ball. Her grandmother Hall had been the belle of her ball. Eleanor was not. She writes of that time, "I knew I was the first girl in my mother's family who was not a belle, and though I never acknowledged it to any of them at that time, I was deeply ashamed." Because Eleanor's Uncle Teddy is the President of the United States, the newspaper social columns are careful to not call his niece's debut a failure. Otherwise, she might have suffered more humiliation. Instead, articles about Eleanor are filled in with nostalgic memories of her mother's beauty and charm. Did Eleanor read these columns and realize she had missed the mark? Did the other debutantes turn their heads to whisper cruel comments behind her back? Eleanor acknowledges, "I was struggling through informal society each night, and yet I would not have wanted at that age to be left out, for I was still haunted by my upbringing and believed that what was known as New York society was really important." In this siren's call of the Gilded Age, Eleanor tries to follow her heart and do meaningful work for the poor. She volunteers at a settlement house in the city. The settlement movement is a social reform effort of the late 1800s to have the rich and the poor live more closely together, diversify the neighborhood. The focus of a settlement house in a poor urban area that houses middle-class volunteers who can help provide food, academic instruction, and cultural lessons to the low-income neighbors, particularly children. Eleanor has done charity work before, but from a distance. She has visited hospitals and orphanages with her family during holidays to help with such niceties like decorating a Christmas tree. Now she dives into her new volunteer world. Refusing rides with her friends in carriages, she chooses public transportation and starts learning a new point of view. Eleanor writes, "The dirty streets, crowded with foreign-looking people, filled me with terror, and I often waited at a corner for a car, watching with a great deal of trepidation." In the midst of volunteering and the debutante balls, Eleanor is seeing Franklin. One afternoon, he comes with her to parts of New York City he has never known. He is stunned by the living conditions of these people. Eleanor is touched by this soft spot in Franklin's heart, and she opens up to him. She starts becoming needier of his presence in her daily life, and she begins conceding her goals at the settlement house for his political dreams. Mademoiselle Sylvestre's letter, your life, which is entirely new and entirely different, and in several respects entirely contradictory, is going to take you and drag you into its turmoil, is about to become a fulfilled prophecy. Chapter 3, Marriage. Franklin, aside from being Eleanor's fifth cousin once removed, is an only child. For every moment of callous neglect in Eleanor's life, Franklin was being pampered and coddled by two parents. At 8 years old, he writes, "Mama left this morning, and I am going to take my bath alone." Mama is Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Able to recite her Delano lineage back to William the Conqueror, Sarah can trump anyone who dares to compare their family history with hers. This haughty heritage is her greatest gift to Franklin. She declares, "My son Franklin is a Delano, not a Roosevelt at all. Sarah conveniently ignores that her family's wealth came from the lucrative but unseemly business trade of opium. Sarah lives and breathes society, which at that time was so important it really did have a capital S. Enjoying her position at the peak of this pyramid, Sarah cannot imagine having Jews or politicians in her beloved mansion any more than she can imagine someday having a mixed-race president. Stories prevail in polite whispers about Sarah's intrusive interactions into the minutest details of Franklin's life. A family friend says of her, "She was an indulgent mother, but would not let her son call his soul his own. Franklin's father isn't much better." James Roosevelt, a widower, is 52 when he marries Sarah, who is 26. They reside at Springwood, their estate on the Hudson River. James is every bit as committed to raising Franklin as is Sarah. He teaches Franklin to swim, fish, ride, hunt, sail, and golf. James envisions that his son will carry on the country squire position which he is carefully crafting. With the airs of an English nobleman, James can outsnob the Vanderbilts who live up the road. When an invitation comes from them for dinner, James refuses on the grounds, "If we accept, we will have to have these people in our home." James's saving grace from this imperious perspective is his teaching Franklin a recurring motif of the Roosevelt families, to ease the suffering of the lower class. Sarah isn't so impressed with this trait, but James manages to pass it on to Franklin. This ability for Franklin to reach past his own egocentric behaviors and consider the plight of the less fortunate is the point of connection he shares with Eleanor. It is this spark during their courtship that will keep them together during tumultuous years ahead. Franklin is attending Harvard when his father dies. Because Sarah can't bear to be alone, she rents a house in Boston to be near her son. During this time, Franklin has started seeing Eleanor. Whether it is devious or self-preservation, Franklin has not told his mother about Eleanor and his plans to marry her. When Sarah is informed about her son's intentions, she is not pleased. She extracts from Franklin the promise that he will keep the engagement a secret for 1 year. The year includes tickets for a 6-week cruise to the Caribbean. There are 3 first-class reservations, one for Sarah, one for Franklin, and one for any friend of his, as long as it isn't Eleanor. Franklin agrees. Eleanor remembers a comment that Sarah once said to her. "If you would just run a comb through your hair, dear, you would look so much nicer." Eleanor's desire to appease degrades her standard of integrity when she accepts Franklin's agreement to keep the engagement secret. Living a falsehood is not Eleanor's forte. Although she follows the rules of decorum and does not express her emotions directly, it makes her angry. If she lashes out, she immediately follows with an apology. She writes to Franklin, "I've come to the conclusion that I need someone to watch over my temper. It makes me so cross with myself to lose it, and yet I am forever doing it." Frustrated with Sarah's iron will to interfere, Eleanor's own iron will emerges to win Sarah over. Practiced in the craft of placating, Eleanor knows the first thing to do is look small and exude helplessness. Eleanor does this with both Sarah and Franklin. She has been signing her letters to Franklin just as she had her father, "Your dear little Nell." Eleanor's ability to diminish her desires becomes apparent as her work at the settlement house starts taking a back burner. Wanting to see Franklin more often, she writes him, "I would not be going, I'm afraid, but one must do something, or not having the person who is all the world to me would be unbearable." Eleanor has hardly considered her volunteering a mere something. In fact, her personal commitment has annoyed relatives, and they worry she will bring home some disease. Now that she is reverting back to being politely involved, She cuts herself off not only from the work she loves, but from female friends who would support her independence. Eleanor, 19 years old, could join a couple of these ladies and go to college. She doesn't. She continues to shift her interests to Franklin. Eleanor, explaining the social realities as she reflects back on that time, says, "It was a wife's duty to be interested in whatever interested her husband, whether it was politics, books, or a particular dish for dinner." For anyone shaking their heads in wonder and asking, why is she doing this? It is a valid question. The few years of nurturing support Eleanor received at Allenwood have not been enough to counterbalance the effects of her dysfunctional family and this tightly scripted society. In a letter to Franklin, Eleanor writes, "I feel lost without you somewhere near. I used to think myself so self-sufficient, but I'm learning too quickly how much of my happiness lies in someone else's hands." What about Franklin? For a man whose insulated life and nonchalance has earned him the nickname Feather Duster, Eleanor, her serious demeanor, hardly seems a fit. There are other debutantes eager to accommodate Franklin's frivolous ego. What Eleanor gives is a younger version of what Franklin's mother started. Franklin is to be the center of her attention, but there is more. Eleanor also provides a means to meet his professional aspirations. The history of what motivates Franklin is thoroughly documented in various biographies. They all concur that Franklin loves power, and he is looking to politics to best fulfill this ambition. Considering the deluge of stories that proclaim Franklin's ability to successfully scheme, is it a mere coincidence that he chooses Eleanor, whose uncle is the president? The couple survives the year of secrecy imposed by Sarah, and eventually their engagement is announced. Notes of congratulation follow. It is one of the few times Franklin is not the lead attraction. A secretary of Franklin's later writes, "He said that when his engagement was announced, all the congratulations were showered on him for securing Eleanor as a wife. He felt," he said, "that some people at least should have congratulated her for securing him as a husband." Not everyone will agree with Franklin. An old schoolmate of Eleanor's is not at all impressed with the match. She makes note that Franklin is by no means good enough for her. Sarah maintains the opposite. She has gone along with her son's wishes, but the undercurrent remains. Eleanor is not welcome. Sarah's wedding gift to Eleanor is a choker necklace. The style is also known as a dog collar. Eleanor wants Uncle Teddy to give her away. March 17th is available if the wedding can be arranged around the president attending the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York City. Eleanor and Franklin are married March 17th, 1905. Their honeymoon in Europe is a yo-yo of emotional intimacy and distance. After a few wonderful days in Venice, they travel north, and Franklin suggests a hike up the mountains. Eleanor demurs, and Franklin trots off with another American woman who has been flirting with him. They are gone until after dark. Eleanor doesn't see that she is back in the same position as with her father. Her hopes and feelings are carelessly tossed aside, and she is waiting again. Instead, Eleanor berates herself and says, "I never said a word. I was jealous beyond description." This will lead to years of passive-aggressive behaviors in Eleanor, as Franklin will be a womanizer the rest of his life. In England, Eleanor continues building a doormat persona. While they are visiting friends, Eleanor is asked to give a talk to open the local fair. Her initial reaction is, "Quite certain that I could never utter a word aloud in a public place." On the trip home, Eleanor thinks she is suffering from seasickness. It's morning sickness. Back in New York City, Sarah has insisted she will make housing arrangements for the newlyweds. She has also gone ahead and completely furnished the place and staffed it with servants of her choice. It is conveniently 3 blocks from Sarah's city house. Sarah's disregard for her daughter-in-law's preferences successfully muzzles Eleanor's opinions in anything. Franklin, never wanting to confront his mother, doesn't ever come to Eleanor's defense. A tag team for wrestling would marvel at this matchup. Sarah's subversive attacks and Franklin's ability to exploit Eleanor's fears is constantly keeping Eleanor off balance. Eleanor reflects back on this time and says, "Instead of taking any interest in these houses, one of which I was to live in, I left everything to my mother-in-law and my husband." True to the rules of polite society, Eleanor does not ever reveal the honest version in public statements about her personal life. It is left for us to wonder how she felt when Sarah visited and presumed to rearrange the furniture. What leverage is Eleanor left with when this grandma buys horses for her grandsons after Eleanor has taken away their ponies as punishment? Any hint of the truth Eleanor covers with excuses or takes the blame herself. She maintains this stance to the grave. She writes in her autobiography, "I looked at everything from the point of view of what I ought to do, rarely from the standpoint of what I wanted to do. There were times when I almost forgot that there was such a thing as wanting anything." Franklin wants a big family, and so Eleanor has 6 children within the first 11 years of their marriage. She suffers the loss of the 3rd child, who dies at 8 months old. The roles of wife and mother take precedence over her own needs, and any hope of confidence in these roles is extinguished with the constant overriding opinions of her mother-in-law. Sarah makes sure the children know they can always come to her for money, and they will always hear, "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is." The son Elliot will later recall, "Granny spoiled us, and we could do no wrong in her eyes." Eleanor comments about that time, "I was not allowed to take care of the children, nor had I any sense of how to do it." Appeasing Sarah, overbearing nannies, and spending days living up to society's standards all lead to a painful and lonely distance between Eleanor and her children. She is unable to see the similar pattern of her own childhood, where her emotional needs were neither acknowledged nor met. Again, Eleanor reflects back on that time and says, "I stand back and look at myself and think, that isn't you as an individual, that is you as the personage you may happen to have to be for this period of time." Franklin is appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and they move to Washington, D.C. Eleanor dutifully performs the job of a Washington wife, spending every afternoon out calling on the political wives in the city. Never staying more than 6 minutes, she sometimes makes 10 to 30 visits a day. At one point, Eleanor is getting 2,000 invitations a year for Navy teas. Eleanor is expected to keep up the social entertaining at home, too. During one dinner party at their house, Eleanor goes upstairs to say goodnight to the children. She delays going back downstairs for so long that Franklin comes to find her. She tells him, "I just can't stand to greet all those people. I know they all think I am dull and unattractive. I just want to hide up here." Eleanor is 29 years old. At a fundraising luncheon for hundreds of ladies, Eleanor is asked to speak. She wants to say no, but Sarah is in the audience. Eleanor gets up and makes a request for donations, which results in several thousands of dollars being raised. In spite of this, she says, "I trembled so that I did not know whether I could stand up, and I'm quite sure my voice could not be heard." Eleanor and Franklin are fitting neatly into the prescribed pattern for Washington, D.C. couples. Franklin is free to pursue his dreams, and Eleanor acquiesces to the job of supporting him. Eleanor acknowledges she has become a completely colorless echo of my husband and mother-in-law, and torn between them. I might have stayed a weak character forever if I had not found that out. So the questions begging to be asked are, how does she finally find out she's being a weak character? And how much longer is this going to continue? Eleanor is getting to the point of finally pushing back. She writes, "The bottom dropped out of my own particular world, and I faced myself, my surrounding, my world honestly for the first time. I really grew up that year. Chapter 4, Crisis. It's the summer of 1918. Eleanor will be turning 34. She and Franklin are still in Washington, D.C. World War I will finish in a few months with an international casualty count that exceeds 37 million. Over the years, Eleanor has struggled to exceed the expectations for a political wife and mother of 5 children. Her reputation has grown along with her skills at being organized and running a house. She is the good wife, and Sunday evenings at the Roosevelt residence has become the place to be. At these events, Eleanor enjoys lively political conversation and policy debate. Her ability to translate for foreign visitors from France or Germany is quaintly juxtaposed to her serving their traditional Sunday evening meal, scrambled eggs. A benefit to the war, World War I, if there can be one, is the social restrictions being relaxed, and wives are not expected to be out calling every afternoon. With that obligation deferred, Eleanor is free to do more meaningful work. At the Red Cross Motor Corps, Eleanor learns to drive. She sets up the Red Cross canteen and with other women organizes the Navy Red Cross. She gives comfort and company to troops coming in and out of Washington, which includes making coffee, handing out sandwiches, and knitting wool socks. To help her with the multitude of duties is Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's social secretary. For the last 4 years, Lucy has become Eleanor's friend and a fill-in nanny for the Roosevelt children. Anna, 12, James, 11, Elliot, 8, Franklin, 4, and John, 2. During the summers, the family packs up and goes to Campobello, Franklin's family home in Maine. This yearly tradition started when Franklin was a child because his father had always encouraged a love of the outdoors, swimming in the ocean and sailing. Franklin has wanted to pass this on to his own children. For Franklin to break from this plan is troubling for Eleanor. The last couple of years, 1917 and 1918, Franklin has begged off from going with the excuse of work. His insistence that Eleanor should still go to Campobello alone and take the children has her worried. Reflecting back on that time, Eleanor writes, "I guess one of the sad things in life is that rarely do a man and woman fall equally in love with each other, and even more rarely do they so live their lives that they continue to be lovers at times and still develop and enjoy the constant companionship of married life." Eleanor has conceded to Franklin's nights out, men's clubs, stag parties, and flirtations, as long as they are just that, flirtations. Her distrust to leave Franklin alone in D.C. is veiled by voicing minor worries. Franklin writes this letter of reassurance to her. "I really can't stand that house all alone without you, and you were a goosey girl to think, or even pretend to think, that I don't want you here all the summer, because you know I do. But honestly, you ought to have 6 weeks straight at Campo, just as I ought to, only you can and I can't. I know what a whole summer here does to people's nerves, and at the end of this summer I will be like a bear with a sore head. As you know, I am unreasonable and touchy now, but I shall try to improve." His sincere professions are a smokescreen. In September, Eleanor discovers a packet of letters written to Franklin. Eleanor's world shatters. The feminine handwriting and the words of endearment are not hers. Franklin has betrayed her trust, and it is Lucy who has betrayed Eleanor's friendship. The depth of the deception goes deeper as Eleanor comes to understand that Washington society is in cahoots with Franklin's philandering. Eleanor's cousin, Alice, President Roosevelt's daughter, who has always been jealous of her father's attention to Eleanor, has taken particular pleasure in having Lucy and Franklin over for parties when Eleanor is out of town. Eleanor tells Franklin he can have a divorce. Franklin weighs his options. She writes back, looking back on that time, and having learned to stare down fear, I long ago reached the point where there is no living person whom I fear, and few challenges I am not willing to face. If Franklin goes through with a divorce, his mother is threatening to turn off the money, putting an abrupt end to his life of private clubs and yachting. Lack of funds, divorce, and remarrying Lucy, a Catholic, will also end his political career. Franklin promises Eleanor he will never see Lucy again. Franklin saves face with Lucy using the excuse that Eleanor won't give him a divorce. A final weight in Eleanor's emotional sorrow is the double standard she must live by. Franklin's affair is not publicly exposed. In 1918, it is inconceivable that the jilted woman will reveal her husband's affair and expect any public support. She will have pity, but the tide of public opinion will be sympathetic with the man. Eleanor leaves indirect hints to talk about the affair and its effect on her. This poem, Psyche, by Virginia Moore, is one of the clues. The soul that has believed and is deceived thinks nothing for a while. All thoughts are vile. And then because the sun is mute persuasion, and hope in spring and fall, most natural, the soul grows calm and mild, a little child, finding the pull of breath better than death. The soul that had believed and was deceived ends by believing more than ever before. It was found in the nightstand of Eleanor's bedroom after her death. At the top of the paper, Eleanor had inscribed 1918. This is the end of part 1. In this pause, before part 2 is the segment Reflections for the Reader, where insights gained from Eleanor's life can now be applied to your life. These insights and themes are classic storylines in books and movies. I will use them as analogies. To signal a pause between each reflection, there will be a bell rung. There are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they keep on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before. This is from O Pioneers by Willa Cather. The struggle of surviving bad parenting is a classic storyline. Look at Walt Disney movies like Cinderella. The stepmother's ego has unrealistic expectations for her daughters. Cinderella suffers under the berating bitterness of this delusion. Eleanor bears the burden of her mother's and her father's delusions. A measure of how deep the childhood emotional scars go does not correlate to the degree of a trauma. It correlates to how the adults in power handle pressure and have honest expectations. In the movie Star Wars, Luke has Obi-Wan Kenobi. For Rocky Balboa, he has the boxing coach. Eleanor has her teacher, Mademoiselle Sylvestre. Survivors who succeed have at least one person who believed in them. In the hero's journey, the excitement is often when the hero is getting out of trouble that their naivete or emotional needs got them into, i.e., Pinocchio. Eleanor, with her insecurities, makes her share of mistakes. The overwhelming evidence is this. Eleanor learned from her experiences and moved on. When Eleanor and Franklin married, they were both young and immature. Wow, that's got to be a first. For some couples, they can grow and stay together. For others, they grow and separate. For others, they stagnate so as not to upset the status quo. In the movie Romancing the Stone, Joan Wilder and Jack Colton have plunged over a waterfall. This is the crisis. Jack, not seeing Joan, thinks she has died. When she pops up, Jack calls out to her, "I thought you drowned." Joan replies, "I did." Joan continues her story now as a stronger woman. Eleanor's plunge was for months, not seconds, and there was no Prince Charming waiting for her. She was alone. A crisis can be seen as a challenge to let the old self die. Part 2, Awakening. Context and comments. September of 1918 coincides with a best-selling book. It's the talk of the town in Washington, D.C. To appreciate the dark irony, this plays out for Eleanor, here's a quick historical digression. At the start of the American Revolution, John Adams is a Boston lawyer and argues the defense of the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. Not exactly a career-making choice, but John stands for justice even when it favors the enemy. He reminds the courtroom, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. John wins the case, and it doesn't appear to be a detriment to the family name. He becomes a founding father, the second president of the United States, and his son, John Quincy Adams, becomes the sixth president. The first part of John's quote, "Facts are stubborn things," has remained popular to this day. Henry Adams, 1838 to 1918, John Quincy's grandson, knows his great-grandfather's famous words, too. He also knows that facts, like his having an affair and his wife's consequential suicide, will tarnish his image. So rather than argue the facts, Henry simply withholds the facts. Here are the facts. Clover, 1843 to 1885, is an early pioneer in photography, is part of the in crowd of Washington society, and is a linguist whose work helps her husband's research in writing a book for which he will become famous. Much like Eleanor's selfless devotion to Franklin, Clover abides by her husband's wishes to not pursue photography as anything more than a hobby. When offers are made to purchase her photos, she demurs to Henry's demand to say no. Clover discovers her allegiance does not buy her husband's fidelity. Her anguish is doubled upon knowing the affair is with a younger woman who has been a long-time family friend to both Clover and Henry. Clover kills herself with the chemicals she used to create her photos. She swallows potassium cyanide. Henry tosses the red herring of depression as the excuse for Clover's death, and his grief as the reason for him destroying all evidence of Clover's existence. In a grave with no name, Clover is buried at Rock Creek Cemetery outside Washington, D.C. Henry commissions a bronze statue as a memorial. This cloaked, seated figure is created with shoulders slumped back to the granite wall behind it. With the right hand in a listless touch to the cheek, the spiritless face, shrouded by a hood, stares vacantly at space in front of the knees. It is referred to as the grief statue. To this day, a Google search of Henry Adams reports that his wife, Clover Adams, committed suicide because of depression. A Google search of Clover repeats the same story. Henry's affair is omitted. Henry's book is published, The Education of Henry Adams. Readers wonder if it is possible that remorse wins over when they see that Henry wrote, "The American woman of the 19th century will live only as the man saw her. This is pure loss to history, for the American woman of the 19th century was much better company than the American man." But alas, it is just another gross layer of guile and a means of buttering up to his paramour. She was reading and editing the initial manuscripts. His book is a bestseller and the buzz of Washington. Stories of Clover's demise resurface, not in light of reading about her in Henry's autobiography, but instead by Henry's omission. He has left out not only her suicide, but any mention of their 13-year marriage. Enjoying a dose of morbid humor, readers howl when, in spite of the blatant omission in writing about his life, the book wins a Pulitzer Prize. The year Henry's book is the talk of the town, the year a renewed remembrance of Clover's suicide is whispered over the rim of teacups. It is 1918, and this same crowd is buzzing because they also know that Lucy Mercer just got fired. Chapter 5, Emancipation. Clover's memorial becomes Eleanor's refuge. Day after day at Rock Creek Cemetery, Eleanor sits. She is unable to move on with life. Stuck in what she dreaded most, she is living a repeat tragedy of her mother and her father. Her game of giving didn't work. As Eleanor spirals down this internal journey, so often called the dark night of the soul, does she seethe with self-loathing, knowing she has complied with the rules of discretion and not made a public fuss? Henry Adams had dined at their house. Did she ever confront him? Does she choke on a sob, recognizing her part in betraying Clover? Does she wonder if Franklin will follow the example of Henry if she should choose suicide? Will her existence be glossed over? With the twisted expectations, do Eleanor's shoulders sag from the pressure in this culture to conform to the image of good wife, even if it kills you? Should she let it kill her too? The headlines about Clover's death had read depression, and public opinions bolstered the rumors of Clover being unstable, pointing to other women in her family who suffered bouts of melancholy. This pat response is much more palatable. It is easier to acknowledge rather than upset the balance of power. In truth, Clover had been in a family of strong, intelligent women. So was Clover's depression really despair? Does Eleanor weep as she recognizes that society will stoop to the excuse of mental illness? A favorite saying of Eleanor's later in life is, "Remember always that you not only have the right to be an individual, you have an obligation to be one." During the months ahead, Franklin's efforts to be more thoughtful are minimal at best. At family gatherings, he overindulges with drinking, is loud and obnoxious, and still plays the ladies' man. This is particularly embarrassing to Eleanor since she and her family remember the drunken episodes of her father. Any solace from her children is wishful thinking. Outmaneuvered by Sarah's money and the spoils of living at Springwood, Eleanor is pigeonholed to the role of being a disciplinarian. The script is further amplified when the children are shielded from the truth and do not understand their mother's mental anguish. They only see that their mother is cross and unhappy. Eleanor says of those days, "There are times in everyone's life when the wish to be done with burdens, and even of this life, seems overwhelming." After weeks of dark pondering, Eleanor gradually realizes another option. She will stop living by the dictates of others and start living her life her own way, the Eleanor way. She will say many times in the years ahead, "Life is meant to be lived. That's all there is to it." Her transformation is not overnight. Sarah will challenge the change, and Franklin is still going to be Franklin. 3 years after the affair, there is a second major event that is to alter Eleanor's life. Franklin is diagnosed with infantile paralysis, polio. He is paralyzed from the waist down. Without the aid of leg braces, he will never walk again. Eleanor is a constant nurse and companion. She might have been referring back to this time when she was on a radio program by Edward R. Murrow, and she says, "I think I am pretty much of a fatalist. You have to accept whatever comes, and the only important thing is that you meet it with courage and with the best that you have to give." Adding to the strain of caring for her husband and meeting the needs of their children is the war of wills with her mother-in-law. Sarah wants her son to retreat from public life and come back to Springwood. Is Eleanor tempted to side with Sarah? She would not only win her mother-in-law's favor, but also the keys of control over Franklin. However, Eleanor supports Franklin's decision to press on with any rehabilitation possibilities and then return to politics. This confrontation with Sarah is an early sign that Eleanor is standing up for what she wants for her family. Eleanor also knows she doesn't want to be tied to the job of being Franklin's gatekeeper. She will keep Franklin's political dreams alive while he convalesces, and she is pursuing her own interests. Years later, when Eleanor reflects back to this time, she comments that it made me stand on my own 2 feet in regard to my husband's life, my own life, and my children's training. Eleanor gets involved with the International Congress of Working Women. These women, famous activists in their own right, help educate her about underlying social issues. Eleanor also joins and gives speeches for groups such as the League of Women Voters and the Women's Trade Union League. She petitions for playgrounds, public housing, school lunches, nursing facilities, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation. She writes articles for magazines like Red Book and McCall's and teaches classes while being vice principal at Todd Hunter, a school for girls. Another favorite saying of Eleanor's is, "Do one thing every day that scares you." In 1926, Eleanor is picketing with 300 other women in support of a group on strike. She makes headlines, not for picketing, but for being arrested. She and 7 other women of prominence are taken in for ignoring police orders to move on and disorderly conduct. Striding toward authenticity is not a straight line forward for Eleanor. Societal constraints are such that women aren't supposed to acknowledge they enjoy a good political fight any more than they can acknowledge they like sex. Eleanor's reports back to Franklin are wrapped in wording that also allays her lingering needs to assure her place at Franklin's side as his supportive secondary. She writes, "You need not be proud of me, dear. I'm only being active till you can be again. It isn't such a great desire on my part to serve the world, and I'll fall back into habits of sloth quite easily." Eleanor's choice of self-deprecation is interesting. She is pointing out, by means of derision, her greatest asset. Far from ever having habits of sloth, this woman is a barrel of industrial strength energy. Her critics, the media, and her friends all acknowledge it is exhausting to keep up with her. Aside from a grueling schedule, she knits. She knits while waiting to give a speech, during meetings, or giving dictation. She is always knitting. It is Franklin who cries out in mock despair, "Lord, just let Eleanor be tired." Building a new life takes time, and there are long days when Eleanor is still struggling. A lonely sigh can be heard as her pen scratches in her journal the day of her birthday. "I'm 35. Margaret and Hall sent me a book. Mama and Tissy and Franklin wired." Everyone is busy with their own life. Eleanor is alone. The difference is, this Eleanor will do something about her loneliness. The old Eleanor would have stood at the door, waiting.